Once the lake house is hers, he won't matter.
I want my own attorney to explain this.
That isn't necessary.
He controlled every amendment.
What is missing?
The asset schedules.
Juan Ross was 44 years old and worked as an operations director for a regional logistics company in Indianapolis, Indiana. To everyone around him, he looked like an ordinary husband living far below his wife's standards. Friends assumed Sophie Ross had married a man with little ambition because he still drove an 11-year-old Ford Explorer, carried homemade lunches, and repaired his own shoes. What they didn't know was that Juan had quietly paid more than $1.2 million to erase Sophie's family's debts over the last decade. Then he stopped outside a half-open kitchen door and heard Richard Bennett whisper, "Once the lake house is finally in Sophie's name, he won't matter anymore. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, let me know your country and your local time. In the comments, I always enjoy seeing where these stories reach. And if you enjoy slow-burn stories with powerful twists and satisfying endings, consider subscribing so you won't miss tomorrow's story." Juan Ross did not leave the Bennett family gathering through the front door. He walked out through the backyard gate instead. The October air in Carmel, Indiana felt colder than it had only minutes earlier. Dry maple leaves scraped across the brick patio as he crossed the lawn without making a sound. Behind him, laughter drifted through the kitchen windows as if nothing unusual had happened. Richard Bennett had already moved on to another conversation. Susan Bennett was pouring wine for guests. Someone turned on a football game inside the family room. No one realized Juan had heard enough to change the direction of his life. He sat inside his aging Ford Explorer without starting the engine. His hands rested on the steering wheel. They did not shake. That surprised even him. For several long minutes, he simply stared through the windshield at the large lake house Richard had purchased 3 years earlier. Everyone believed Richard had rebuilt his fortune through discipline and careful investments after surviving years of financial hardship. Juan knew another version of that story. The beginning had started nearly 10 years earlier. Back then, Juan was 34 years old and working as a logistics manager for Midwest Distribution Systems in Indianapolis. His salary was comfortable, but hardly extraordinary. He rented a modest townhouse, drove a used pickup truck, and rarely spent money on himself. He met Sophie Bennett at a charity fundraising event organized by Riley Children's Foundation. She was warm without trying to impress anyone. Unlike many people Juan met through work, Sophie asked questions and actually listened to the answers. She worked as a pediatric occupational therapist at Ascension St. Vincent Hospital. Her life revolved around helping children recover from injuries and developmental disorders. She never talked about luxury. She talked about patients who finally learned to tie their shoes. Juan admired that. Within a year, they were married. Only after the wedding did Juan begin understanding the financial disaster surrounding Sophie's family. Richard Bennett had once owned a small commercial construction company outside Indianapolis. During the recession, several contracts collapsed. 2 lawsuits followed. Then came unpaid taxes, a failed equipment lease, 3 refinancing attempts, medical bills after Susan underwent heart surgery. Credit cards carried balances so large that minimum payments barely covered interest. Kyle Bennett, Sophie's younger brother, had also contributed to the chaos. He had opened an automotive customization business that failed within 18 months. Instead of accepting responsibility, Kyle blamed suppliers, employees' weather banks, and eventually the economy itself. The debts accumulated faster than anyone admitted. One Sunday afternoon, only 6 months after the wedding, Richard invited Juan into his home office. Stacks of unopened envelopes covered the desk. A foreclosure notice sat beneath a coffee mug. Richard looked older than his 62 years. I hate asking this," Richard had said quietly. Juan remembered every word. "I've exhausted every loan I qualify for." Juan asked only one question. How much time do you have? Richard rubbed his forehead. 31 days. Juan went home carrying copies of mortgage statements, tax notices, and payment demands. That evening, Sophie cried for the first time since their marriage. I don't want you fixing this, she whispered. I just don't want to lose my parents. Juan sat beside her on their living room floor. He looked through every document one page at a time. Nothing about the situation looked impossible. It looked expensive. There was a difference. The following Monday, Juan requested a meeting with his financial advisor, Martin Alvarez. Martin had managed Juan's investments for several years. After reviewing every document, Martin leaned back in his chair. You can help, he said, but don't do it casually. Juan frowned. What do you mean? Martin folded his hands. Every payment needs documentation. Their family. Martin nodded. Their family today? The sentence lingered. Juan almost laughed. Instead, he hired an attorney. Not because he distrusted anyone, because Martin insisted. Attorney Melissa Grant prepared simple repayment acknowledgments for every major payment Juan made. Richard signed them without hesitation. So this is just paperwork? Richard asked. Melissa smiled professionally. It texts everyone. Nobody objected. Over the next 18 months, Juan paid overdue property taxes. He negotiated medical bills. He satisfied collection accounts. He prevented foreclosure. He refinanced high-interest obligations into manageable loans. He even sold one investment account to eliminate a business judgment that threatened Richard's remaining assets. Whenever money moved, Juan kept copies. Wire confirmations, cashier's checks, signed receipts, emails, settlement letters, bank statements. Everything went into labeled binders inside a locked cabinet at his house. He never imagined opening them again. Sophie often apologized after every payment. You've already done too much. Juan always answered the same way. We're building stability. He believed it. For a while, everyone else seemed to believe it too. Family dinners became cheerful again. Richard smiled more. Susan stopped crying during holidays. Kyle even hugged Juan after the bank officially released a tax lien. You saved all of us, Kyle said. Juan nodded politely. He never expected gratitude to last forever. He simply hoped things would improve. For several years they did. Or at least they appeared to. Richard found consulting work with commercial developers. Susan began organizing charity luncheons again. Kyle started another business. This time it involved residential property renovations. Sophie believed the worst had passed. Juan wanted to believe her. His own career also accelerated. He earned promotions steadily. Operations manager, regional operations manager, eventually operations director. His income increased, but so did his responsibilities. He spent long days traveling between distribution centers across Indiana, Illinois, and Ohio. Yet every few months, another call arrived. Richard's truck transmission had failed. Kyle needed bridge financing. Susan's insurance denied a procedure. An unexpected tax assessment appeared. Each emergency sounded temporary. Each request sounded reasonable. Each payment became another line inside Juan's growing financial records. He never complained. Not once. His co-workers assumed he was unusually frugal because he still packed sandwiches every morning. His neighbors wondered why someone with an executive title continued driving an old SUV with faded paint. Juan simply smiled. He disliked unnecessary spending. Besides, every extra dollar seemed to solve another family crisis. Then small things began changing. Richard stopped saying thank you. Instead, he started saying things like, "You're doing well these days." Kyle no longer asked for help. He announced how much he needed. Susan occasionally joked during dinners. Good thing Sophie married someone reliable. Everyone laughed. Juan laughed too. Only Sophie looked uncomfortable. She always reached beneath the table and gently squeezed his hand. That small gesture reminded him why he kept helping. He wasn't buying approval. He was protecting the woman he loved from watching her family collapse. Years passed. The debts shrank. The Bennett family lifestyle quietly improved. New furniture appeared. Luxury vacations showed up on social media. Kyle traded his pickup truck for a new luxury SUV. Richard joined an exclusive golf club. Susan wore jewelry Juan had never seen before. None of it made immediate sense. Whenever Juan asked how business was going, Richard always answered the same way. "We're finally getting ahead." Juan wanted that to be true. Still, something no longer fit. One Tuesday morning, after transferring another $28,400 to resolve what Richard described as a final IRS payment plan adjustment, Juan stopped by First Indiana Community Bank to confirm the wire had cleared. The senior banking officer reviewed the transaction history. She looked at the screen longer than expected. Then she looked back at Juan. Her expression remained professional, but curiosity slipped through. "Mr. Ross," she asked carefully, "may I ask you something?" Juan nodded. "Certainly." She lowered her voice. "Every significant payment on these obligations has come directly from your personal accounts." She paused. "I don't see a single repayment coming back." Juan remained silent. Then she asked the question that stayed with him all the way home. "Are you absolutely certain you're the only one carrying this family's financial burden?" The question from the senior banking officer stayed with Juan Ross far longer than he expected. He replayed it while driving home through evening traffic on Interstate 465. He heard it again while changing the oil in his old Ford Explorer the following Saturday. He heard it while standing beside Sophie in church the next morning. "Are you absolutely certain you're the only one carrying this family's financial burden?" Until that moment, Juan had never thought of himself as someone carrying a burden. He believed he was carrying responsibility. There was a difference. Responsibility came with purpose. A burden implied someone else had quietly placed unnecessary weight on his shoulders. Juan refused to believe that about Sophie's family. Not yet. Life continued much as it always had. Monday through Friday, Juan managed distribution centers, negotiated shipping contracts, and solved problems before most employees even knew they existed. His calm leadership earned respect throughout Midwest distribution systems. Drivers trusted him because he listened before making decisions. Warehouse supervisors appreciated that he never blamed people before examining facts. His work followed one simple principle. Every problem left evidence. Find the evidence first, then decide. Without realizing it, Juan lived by the same principle at home. He simply had not applied it to his own family. One Friday evening, Richard Bennett called. His voice sounded unusually cheerful. "Good news," Richard announced. "I've been invited into a commercial property investment." Juan smiled. "That's great." "It is." There was a pause. "Actually, I need a little bridge financing." Juan closed his office door. "How much?" "Only $45,000. The word "only" barely registered. Richard explained that the investment would return twice that amount within 18 months. "It'll be the last time I ever ask." Juan had heard those exact words before. Not similar words. The exact sentence. He opened the spreadsheet he maintained for his personal finances. The file contained every transfer made during the previous decade. $45,000 would not create financial hardship. But something inside him hesitated. Not because of the amount, because he suddenly wondered how many last times there had already been. "I'll think about it," Juan replied. Richard sounded surprised. "Think about it. I'll let you know Monday." After ending the call, Juan searched the spreadsheet. He highlighted every transfer involving the Bennett family. The list continued far beyond the visible screen. Medical payments, mortgage assistance, tax settlements, business loans, emergency repairs, legal fees, insurance deductibles, college tuition assistance for Kyle, home repairs after storm damage, vehicle replacements, vacation cancellations because someone had supposedly exhausted savings. Year after year, line after line, he totaled everything. The number appeared, $1.184, 362.41. Juan stared at it. Not because he regretted helping, because he had never added everything together before. The total represented nearly 10 years of disciplined saving, investing bonuses, and stock appreciation. He had never purchased a luxury vehicle. He had postponed remodeling his own kitchen twice. He still wore suits tailored nearly 8 years earlier. He always told himself there would be time later. Helping family came first. Sophie walked into the study carrying 2 cups of coffee. "What are you working on?" Juan minimized the spreadsheet. "Just organizing finances." She smiled. "You always organize finances." She kissed his forehead before sitting beside him. "You know, Dad called me today." Juan looked up. "What did he want?" "He said he might ask you about an investment." "He already did." Sophie sighed. "I wish he wouldn't." Juan studied her expression carefully. She looked tired. Not defensive, just exhausted. "You don't like asking me anymore." She shook her head immediately. "I never liked it." "Then why do you always tell me they're desperate?" "Because they usually are." Usually. The word caught his attention. Usually left room for exceptions. Juan said nothing. Instead, he reached for her hand. "I know you love them." "I do." "And I know you love me." "I do?" She smiled gently. "I hate feeling caught between both worlds." Juan believed her completely. The narrator could see what Juan could not. Sophie's conflict was genuine. She had spent years believing every crisis her parents described. Whenever Richard called, urgency filled every conversation. Whenever Susan cried, Sophie felt responsible. She never investigated because she never imagined her parents would deceive her. Juan understood none of that. He only saw the woman trying to keep everyone together. Monday morning, Juan approved the transfer. $45,000 disappeared from his investment account before noon. Richard thanked him enthusiastically. 3 days later, Juan happened to stop at a fuel station outside Carmel after visiting one of the company's warehouses. Across the street sat a luxury dealership. A black Cadillac Escalade slowly exited the parking lot. Kyle Bennett sat behind the wheel. The temporary dealer tag fluttered beneath the rear window. Juan watched the SUV merge into traffic. Maybe Kyle had leased it. Maybe someone else owned it. Maybe there was a reasonable explanation. He drove away without mentioning it. That weekend, the Bennett family gathered for Susan's birthday dinner. Richard grilled expensive steaks. Kyle arrived driving the same Escalade. Everyone admired it. Susan laughed proudly. "Isn't it beautiful?" Juan looked toward Kyle. "I thought business was still recovering." Kyle grinned. "It finally turned around." "Congratulations." Richard raised his wine glass. "Sometimes you just have to take risks." Juan smiled politely. No one mentioned the $45,000. No one offered to repay it. No one even acknowledged it. Later that evening, while helping Richard carry empty serving trays into the kitchen, Juan noticed several unopened luxury shopping bags stacked beside the pantry. One displayed the logo of an upscale jewelry boutique in Indianapolis. Another came from a designer furniture store. Richard followed Juan's eyes. "Oh, Susan caught a few sales." Juan nodded. The explanation sounded casual. Too casual. Driving home, Sophie leaned against the passenger window. "Thanks for being patient with my family." Juan glanced toward her. "They're still your family." "I know. They've been through a lot." "They have." She hesitated. I just wish things would finally become normal." Juan wanted that too. The following month, another request arrived. This time, Susan needed help covering an insurance deductible after a plumbing disaster. The month after that, Kyle needed payroll assistance for a renovation project. Then Richard needed temporary cash because a client payment had supposedly been delayed. Each explanation sounded believable. individually. Together, they began forming a pattern. Juan did something he had never done before. He stopped accepting explanations at face value. Instead, he began quietly observing, not investigating, simply observing. He noticed Kyle always seemed to own newer vehicles, despite claiming constant cash shortages. He noticed Susan's social calendar expanded while her financial emergencies never disappeared. He noticed Richard increasingly spoke about investments instead of survival. The language had changed. Years earlier, Richard spoke like a man trying to save his home. Now he spoke like a man planning his next opportunity. Yet the requests for money continued. One rainy afternoon, Juan visited the Bennett home unexpectedly to deliver medication Sophie had forgotten after picking it up from the pharmacy. Richard wasn't home. Susan answered the door. She looked surprised. "Oh, Juan. I just brought Sophie's prescription." "Thank you." As she reached for the bag, Juan noticed something sitting on the hallway console. A leather portfolio. Its corner had slipped open. Inside rested architectural renderings. Across the top page appeared a title, Lake House Renovation Project. Estimated budget, $312,850. Juan's eyes remained on the number for only a second before Susan quietly closed the portfolio. "Richard's helping someone review construction plans." She smiled naturally. Juan smiled back. But while driving away, one thought refused to leave him. $300,000 for renovating a lake house. Only 2 weeks after Richard had needed emergency financial assistance again. For the first time in 10 years, Juan no longer wondered whether the Bennett family still had financial problems. He began wondering whether those problems had ever truly disappeared at all. Juan Ross had built his career by trusting patterns instead of promises. A delayed shipment always left a trail. Missing inventory always appeared somewhere. Numbers that refused to match were rarely accidents. During 10 years of helping Sophie's family, however, he had relied almost entirely on trust. Now, the patterns were beginning to demand his attention. He still refused to jump to conclusions. That was not his nature. Instead, he began paying closer attention to details most people ignored. The first change was almost invisible. Every request for financial help arrived with urgency, yet every explanation lacked documentation. Years earlier, Richard Bennett routinely handed Juan copies of overdue tax notices, medical invoices, mortgage statements, and collection letters. Lately, those papers had disappeared. Now Richard simply explained the situation over the phone. "The accountant says, the bank needs, the contractor requires." There were fewer documents, more stories. Juan noticed it without mentioning it. A week after seeing the architectural plans for the lake house renovation, he received another call from Richard. "This one isn't about money," Richard said cheerfully. "I actually need some advice." Juan agreed to meet him for breakfast at a diner near Keystone Avenue. Richard arrived wearing a brand new navy sport coat. His watch also looked different. Not flashy, expensive. Juan recognized the brand immediately because one of his company's executives wore the same model. It cost nearly $12,000. Richard ordered steak and eggs. As they ate, he spoke enthusiastically about commercial real estate around Indianapolis. "The market is changing." Juan listened. Richard drew diagrams on a paper napkin explaining investment opportunities near Fishers and Noblesville. He sounded confident. Confident people rarely sounded like men drowning in debt. "So," Juan finally asked, "how's cash flow?" Richard smiled. "Better." "That's good. It'll be even better next year." Juan nodded. Then Richard casually added something that caught his attention. "I've been looking at expanding." Expanding. Not recovering, not surviving, expanding. Juan kept his expression neutral. Before leaving, Richard thanked him for years of support. "You've always believed in family." "I still do," Juan answered. Richard smiled broadly. I knew you would. The sentence lingered. It sounded less like appreciation, more like expectation. Later that afternoon, Juan returned to company headquarters. He had a quarterly budget review with Chief Financial Officer Daniel Harper. The meeting lasted nearly 3 hours. When it ended, Daniel walked beside Juan toward the parking garage. You look distracted. Juan laughed quietly. Work follows me home. Daniel glanced sideways. No. This isn't work. Juan didn't answer. Daniel had known him for nearly 15 years. He recognized silence better than excuses. If you ever need another perspective, Daniel said, call me. Juan appreciated that. He rarely discussed personal matters with coworkers. This time he considered it. That evening, Sophie prepared homemade chicken pot pie. They ate quietly. Halfway through dinner, Sophie looked up. My mom called. Juan waited. They're hosting Thanksgiving this year. That's nice. Dad wants everyone there early. Juan smiled. He usually does. Sophie hesitated. Juan. Yes, can I ask something? Of course. If my parents ever became financially independent... She stopped. What? Would you finally spend money on yourself? Juan laughed. What brought that on? She pointed toward his boots. The soles are separating. They still work. You've been saying that for months. He looked down. She wasn't wrong. His boots had become so worn that rain occasionally seeped through one side. She smiled gently. I'd like to see you buy something because you want it. Juan reached across the table and squeezed her hand. Maybe someday. He meant it. Unfortunately, someday always seemed to arrive just after another family emergency. 2 weeks later, Juan attended a regional logistics conference at the Indianapolis Marriott downtown. During a networking reception, he unexpectedly ran into Kyle Bennett. Kyle wasn't attending the conference. He was having drinks with several men wearing tailored suits. Kyle noticed Juan immediately. His smile appeared forced. Juan, I didn't know you were downtown. Business meeting. Kyle introduced the group. One man mentioned property development. Another specialized in commercial lending. A third represented a private investment partnership. Interesting company for someone who regularly claimed cash shortages. The conversation remained friendly. As Juan walked away, he heard one investor laugh. Kyle, that lake house is going to be incredible. Juan kept walking. He never turned around. Back home, he opened his laptop. Not to investigate, simply to review public county records. Property ownership information was available online. Anyone could search it. He entered Richard Bennett's name. Nothing unusual appeared. He searched Susan Bennett. Nothing. He searched Kyle Bennett. Again, nothing unexpected. Finally, almost as an afterthought, he typed Sophie's full legal name. The results surprised him. A recent filing appeared. Property transfer notification, pending review, Hamilton County Recorder's Office. Juan clicked the summary. Very little information was visible. Only the parcel identification number, transfer status, recording date, no detailed documents. He stared at the screen. Sophie had never mentioned any property transfer. Perhaps it involved paperwork Richard needed. Perhaps it meant nothing. Still, he printed the page. Not because he suspected wrongdoing, because something no longer fit. The following Saturday, Sophie spent the afternoon shopping with her mother. Juan stayed home organizing the garage. Near sunset, his phone buzzed. It was his attorney, Melissa Grant. They had spoken only twice during the previous 5 years. Melissa. Hi, Juan. I was updating old client files today. He waited. I came across your repayment documentation. I almost forgot those existed. So did I. She paused. I noticed something. What? The acknowledgements stop about 4 years ago. Juan thought for a moment. Richard said paperwork wasn't necessary anymore. Melissa became quiet. That was your decision? I suppose. I wish you had called me. Juan leaned against his workbench. Why? Because people rarely stop documenting financial obligations after repayment begins. They stop documenting when they no longer expect accountability. The sentence landed harder than she intended. Juan looked across his garage at shelves lined with carefully labeled storage boxes. One shelf held every financial record from the first 6 years. The later years occupied only a thin folder, mostly bank transfers, almost no signatures, almost no written acknowledgments. Somewhere along the way, he had allowed trust to replace procedure. Melissa spoke again. I'm not saying anything improper happened. I know. But if you continue helping anyone financially, I should document everything. Exactly. After hanging up, Juan climbed a small ladder and removed the old archive boxes. Dust covered the lids. Each year had its own binder. Invoices, canceled checks, loan agreements, settlement confirmations, Richard's signatures, Susan's signatures, Kyle's signatures. Everything had once been organized with remarkable care. Then the records became thinner, then thinner still, until almost nothing remained beyond electronic bank transfers. Juan spent nearly 3 hours reviewing the files. He wasn't looking for fraud. He was measuring change. The change was obvious. The Bennett family had gradually stopped treating his financial support like loans. Without ever discussing it, everyone had begun behaving as though the money simply belonged to them. Late that evening, Sophie returned home carrying several shopping bags. She smiled. My mom found some great sales. Juan looked at the bags. One logo matched the luxury boutique he had seen inside Richard's house weeks earlier. Another belonged to a high-end home decor store. Sophie noticed his expression. What? Nothing. You sure? Juan nodded. He was sure of only one thing. He needed facts before questions. The next morning, while sorting the weekend mail, he found a large, certified envelope addressed solely to Sophie Ross. Return address, Hamilton County Recorder's Office, Property Services Division. Sophie was still upstairs getting ready for work. Juan looked at the unopened envelope resting on the kitchen counter. He had no intention of opening mail that wasn't his. But one question echoed through his mind. Why would the county recorder be sending confidential property documents only to Sophie? Juan looked at the certified envelope for several seconds before he stepped away from the kitchen counter. He would not open mail addressed to Sophie. Whatever questions were beginning to form in his mind, they did not justify crossing that line. Instead, he poured himself another cup of coffee, grabbed his briefcase, and left for work. The envelope remained exactly where it was. All morning, however, it occupied a corner of his thoughts. At noon, Sophie sent him a text. Thanks for picking up my prescription yesterday. Love you. Juan smiled. He answered immediately. Love you too. Have a good afternoon. There was nothing unusual about the conversation. Nothing distant, nothing suspicious. If anything, Sophie seemed exactly like the woman he had married 10 years earlier. That realization made everything even more confusing. If something was wrong, he wasn't convinced she knew it. Late that afternoon, Juan attended a meeting with regional warehouse managers in Fort Wayne. While others debated transportation schedules, his mind kept returning to one simple question. Why would Richard transfer property into Sophie's name without mentioning it? If it were a gift, why keep it quiet? If it were part of estate planning, why had no one discussed it? Richard had always involved Juan in major financial conversations before. Now everything seemed to happen without him. By the time Juan arrived home that evening, the certified envelope had disappeared. Sophie was preparing dinner. I had to sign for something from the county this afternoon, she said casually while chopping vegetables. Juan kept his expression relaxed. Oh, Dad is reorganizing some property paperwork, she shrugged. I barely understood half of it. What kind of paperwork? I honestly don't know. She laughed softly. You know my parents. They always wait until the last minute to deal with legal documents. Juan nodded. Did you have to sign anything? Just acknowledging that I received the packet. And then, Dad stopped by after work and picked it up. Juan paused for only a fraction of a second. He picked it up? Yeah. He said his attorney needed the originals. She returned to preparing dinner without another thought. Juan quietly set the table. He noticed something important. Sophie had answered every question naturally. There was no hesitation, no nervousness, no attempt to avoid eye contact. If she was hiding something, she was extraordinarily convincing. His instincts suggested something else. She simply trusted her father. That evening, they watched an old movie together. Sophie fell asleep with her head resting against his shoulder. Juan looked down at her. He remembered the young woman who cried on their apartment floor 10 years earlier because she feared losing her parents' home. That woman never manipulated him. She had never demanded expensive gifts. She had never criticized his simple lifestyle. In fact, she had defended it countless times. Whatever was happening, Juan became increasingly certain of one thing. If deception existed, Sophie might not be the architect. The following Wednesday, Juan received an unexpected invitation from Richard. Come by the lake house Saturday. What for? I want your opinion on a renovation. Juan agreed. Saturday morning arrived with clear skies and cool autumn air. The lake house overlooked a quiet stretch of water about an hour north of Indianapolis. Juan had visited only twice before. The property looked different now. Fresh landscaping surrounded the driveway. New stone columns framed the entrance. Several luxury vehicles were already parked outside. Inside, contractors measured walls, while designers discussed flooring samples. Richard greeted Juan enthusiastically. Perfect timing. He led Juan through room after room explaining renovation plans. We're opening this wall, expanding the kitchen, adding a second-story deck. Every improvement sounded expensive. Finally, Juan asked the question that had been bothering him. This must cost quite a bit. Richard smiled proudly. It'll be worth every penny. I thought cash flow had been tight. Richard's smile faded for an instant before returning. Opportunities appeared. What kind of opportunities? A few investments worked out. Juan nodded politely. He didn't press further. Instead, he quietly observed. One contractor approached Richard holding a clipboard. Mr. Bennett, we need confirmation on ownership before final permits. Richard glanced briefly toward Juan. We'll handle that Monday. The contractor apologized and walked away. Ownership. The word immediately connected itself to the certified envelope. Later, while everyone gathered on the back patio for lunch, Kyle began talking about future plans. This place will easily double in value. Susan laughed. Maybe we'll finally have somewhere for the whole family every summer. Juan noticed Richard watching everyone carefully. Then Richard raised his glass. Family should always protect family. Everyone agreed, except Juan. He simply smiled. The sentence sounded strangely rehearsed. As lunch ended, Juan volunteered to carry empty dishes inside. The kitchen was quiet. From the hallway beyond, faint voices drifted from Richard's study. The door wasn't completely closed. Juan had no intention of listening. Then he heard his own name. He stopped. Not because he wanted to eavesdrop, because hearing your own name has a way of freezing your feet. Richard's voice came first. Juan doesn't ask enough questions. A second voice answered. It belonged to Kyle. He never has. Richard laughed quietly. That's what makes everything easier. Juan remained motionless. Papers shuffled inside the office. Then Susan spoke. I still worry he'll eventually notice. Richard answered immediately. Notice what? How much he's actually paid. He'll never total it. Juan felt his heartbeat slow rather than speed up. Years of crisis management had taught him something unusual. Panic clouds judgment. Calm reveals truth. Kyle spoke next. What if he asks about the property transfer? Richard didn't hesitate. Sophie doesn't even understand what she's signing. Juan's breathing became almost silent. Susan lowered her voice. I don't like keeping her out of it. We're protecting her, Richard replied firmly. Kyle laughed. We're protecting the house. Another brief silence followed. Then came the sentence Juan would replay in his mind for weeks. Once the lake house is finally in Sophie's name, Richard said quietly, Juan won't have any claim to anything he paid for. Nobody answered immediately. Finally, Susan sighed. I just hope he never finds out. Richard's response was cold. If he does, it'll be too late. Footsteps moved toward the study door. Juan immediately picked up the stack of dishes and continued walking naturally into the kitchen. A second later, Kyle stepped into the hallway. There you are, Kyle said with a grin. We thought you got lost. Juan smiled calmly. I was looking for somewhere to leave these. Kyle pointed toward the sink. Just put them there. For the rest of the afternoon, Juan behaved exactly as he always had. He complimented the lake view, he discussed football, he thanked Susan for lunch. He shook Richard's hand before leaving. No one suspected he had heard a single word. Driving home alone, Juan did not call anyone. He did not confront Sophie. He did not accuse Richard. He did not allow anger to make decisions for him. Instead, he remembered the lesson that had made him successful throughout his career. When people reveal part of the truth, they usually leave evidence behind. And for the first time in 10 years, Juan Ross decided he would stop accepting explanations. From that moment forward, he would begin collecting facts. Juan Ross slept very little that night. Not because he was angry, because his mind refused to stop organizing information. By sunrise, he had already filled 3 pages of legal-sized paper with dates, conversations, bank transfers, and questions. He drew no conclusions. He simply separated facts from assumptions. Fact: Richard had accepted more than $1 million in financial assistance over the past decade. Fact: property documents had recently been sent to Sophie. Fact: Richard had privately stated that Juan would have no claim to anything he paid for. Fact: Sophie appeared unaware of whatever paperwork she had signed. Everything else remained unproven. That distinction mattered. Juan had spent his entire career teaching managers never to accuse anyone before understanding the complete picture. He intended to follow his own advice. Monday morning, instead of driving directly to work, he made one additional stop. The office of Melissa Grant occupied the 3rd floor of a brick building overlooking Monument Circle in downtown Indianapolis. She looked surprised to see him without an appointment. Juan, I need an hour. Her expression immediately became serious. Come in. Once they sat down, Juan carefully described everything that had happened during the previous several weeks. He mentioned the property notice, the expensive renovations, the luxury vehicles. Most importantly, he repeated every sentence he had overheard inside Richard's study as accurately as he could remember. Melissa listened without interrupting. When he finished, she folded her hands. I'm glad you came before confronting anyone. So am I. You still don't actually know what legal documents exist. I know. And you don't know whether your wife understands what's happening. I don't. Melissa nodded. Good. Juan looked confused. Good. Yes. You've kept your assumptions separate from your facts. She opened a yellow legal pad. That gives us room to discover the truth instead of defending a theory. Juan leaned back. What should I do? For now, she smiled slightly. Nothing dramatic. No confrontation. No. No accusations. Definitely not. What then? Observe. Melissa explained that financial disputes often became impossible to resolve once emotions overtook evidence. If someone really is misleading you, she said. They'll usually continue doing it. Meaning, people who believe they're safe become careless. Juan understood immediately. His entire career had been built on the same principle. The biggest operational mistakes rarely occurred because people were clever. They happened because people became comfortable. Before he left, Melissa gave him one final recommendation. I'd also like you to speak with someone. Who? A forensic accountant. Juan raised an eyebrow. I don't think we're anywhere near a lawsuit. Hopefully not. But if significant money has moved over 10 years, someone should organize it professionally. She handed him a business card. Across the front appeared one name, Ethan Brooks, CPA, CFF, Certified Public Accountant, Certified in Financial Forensics. 2 days later, Juan sat inside Ethan's office. Unlike many accountants, Ethan possessed an unusually calm personality. His office contained almost no decoration besides neatly organized bookshelves and framed professional certifications. After reviewing Juan's spreadsheets, Ethan whistled softly. You've kept remarkable records. I've always liked organization. I can tell. He scrolled through electronic bank statements while occasionally making notes. After nearly 40 minutes, Ethan looked up. I have 2 observations. Juan waited. First, your documentation during the first 6 years is outstanding. And the second, the last 4 years concern me. Because I stopped requiring acknowledgments. Exactly. Ethan rotated the monitor toward Juan. Look here. He highlighted dozens of outgoing transfers. The money is easy to trace leaving your accounts. Juan nodded. But after that, we have very little. Juan frowned. I assumed repayment would happen eventually. I'm talking about purpose. What do you mean? If someone reviewed these transactions today, many would simply appear to be gifts. Juan remained silent. The possibility had never occurred to him. Ethan continued. That doesn't mean they were gifts. It means intent became harder to prove. Juan rubbed his forehead. So what now? Now we reconstruct everything. Over the next several hours, Ethan created categories. Mortgage assistance, medical expenses, business funding, tax settlements, home repairs, vehicle purchases, educational assistance, emergency transfers. Every payment received supporting documentation whenever possible. Whenever documentation was missing, Ethan noted it separately. By late afternoon, one enormous spreadsheet covered the computer screen. The total remained almost identical to Juan's own calculation, $187,914.83. Including interest lost from liquidated investments, Ethan estimated Juan's actual financial contribution exceeded $1.4 million. Neither man spoke for several moments. Finally, Ethan asked quietly, Did anyone besides your wife know the full amount? I don't think so. Does your wife know? Juan thought carefully. I don't believe she's ever seen the total. Ethan nodded slowly. Then someone else probably hasn't either. Driving home, Juan felt strangely peaceful, not because he had discovered good news, because uncertainty had begun turning into information. Information could be managed. Emotions rarely could. That evening, Sophie was already home. She greeted him with a warm smile. I made your favorite. Chicken parmesan. Juan kissed her forehead. It smells amazing. Throughout dinner, they talked about ordinary things. A difficult patient at the hospital, a warehouse expansion project, weekend plans. Nothing about money. Nothing about Richard. Watching Sophie laugh at one of his terrible jokes, Juan became increasingly convinced she truly had no idea what was unfolding around her. After dinner, she carried dishes toward the sink. My parents invited us over Sunday. Juan dried a plate. For what? Dad says he has an announcement. What kind? He wouldn't tell me. She laughed. You know how he likes surprises. Juan smiled politely. I do. Sunday arrived with unusually warm weather for late October. The Bennett home bustled with activity. Richard appeared happier than Juan had seen him in years. Kyle uncorked expensive bottles of wine. Susan had prepared an elaborate meal. Halfway through dinner, Richard stood and tapped his glass. I've been waiting to share something. Everyone looked toward him. Our attorney has nearly completed our long-term estate planning. Susan smiled proudly. Richard continued. I finally reached the point where I can think about legacy instead of survival. Everyone applauded politely. Juan joined them. Then Richard looked directly at Sophie. You've always been the responsible one. Sophie's face reddened. Dad? I mean it. He reached into a leather folder beside his chair and removed several elegant presentation folders. I wanted you to have these. Sophie accepted them with surprise. What are they? Just preliminary estate documents. She opened the first page but quickly looked overwhelmed by the legal language. I don't understand any of this. Richard laughed. You don't need to tonight. We'll explain everything later. Juan watched quietly. Richard never offered him a copy. Instead, he smoothly redirected the conversation toward dessert. Nobody else seemed to notice. Juan did. On the drive home, Sophie placed the folder on the back seat without opening it again. I'll read all that tomorrow. Juan glanced at her. Want any help? She smiled. Maybe. But legal paperwork makes my head hurt. Juan nodded. He believed her. The following afternoon, while Sophie worked a late shift, Juan received a phone call from Ethan Brooks. I've found something. Juan closed his office door. What is it? I started cross-referencing several publicly available business records. And I think Richard Bennett has been involved in more real estate transactions than anyone realizes. Juan's heartbeat remained steady. How many? I don't know yet. But enough that I think we're looking at a much bigger picture. Juan stared silently through his office window. Outside trucks moved methodically across the distribution yard. Everything appeared orderly, predictable. Yet beneath the surface of his own life, another pattern was slowly emerging. And for the first time, someone besides Juan had begun seeing it too. Juan ended the call with Ethan Brooks and remained seated in his office long after the line went silent. Outside his window, forklifts carried pallets from one trailer to another with practiced precision. Every movement followed a schedule. Every shipment left a record. He wished family relationships worked the same way. Instead of returning immediately to work, Juan opened a fresh notebook. Across the first page, he wrote a single sentence. Do not assume. Verify. It had become his rule. For the rest of the week, he focused on his responsibilities at Midwest Distribution Systems, while quietly allowing Ethan and Melissa to continue reviewing the available records. He did not search Richard's house. He did not question Kyle. He did not mention the conversation he had overheard. Most importantly, he did not allow his behavior towards Sophie to change. If she truly knew nothing, she deserved honesty and patience. If she knew more than she admitted, the truth would eventually reveal itself. Either way, rushing would accomplish nothing. Friday afternoon, Ethan called again. I've finished the first review. Juan drove directly to Ethan's office after work. Several folders lay neatly arranged across the conference table. Ethan pointed to a printed timeline. I started with public property records, corporate filings, and mortgage releases. Juan took a seat. What did you find? Richard wasn't exaggerating when he said he became involved in commercial real estate. Is that unusual? No. Ethan slid several pages across the table. What surprised me was the timing. Juan examined the documents. Several limited liability companies had been formed over the previous 6 years. Some listed Richard as manager, others listed outside investors. Kyle's name appeared on 2 filings. None of the businesses appeared illegal, none appeared hidden. Everything had been properly registered. "So what's the issue?" Juan asked. Ethan tapped the timeline. "Look at the formation dates." Juan compared them against his financial spreadsheet. One company had been organized less than 3 months after Juan paid nearly $80,000 to resolve Richard's outstanding tax obligations. Another appeared shortly after Juan financed what Richard described as an emergency business loan. A third had been created only weeks after Juan helped refinance Richard's mortgage. The pattern wasn't proof of anything, but the timing was impossible to ignore. Ethan leaned back. "I'm not saying your money funded these businesses, but it created breathing room." "Exactly." Juan looked out the conference room window. "So, while I believed I was helping someone recover, he may have been building something new." Juan nodded slowly. That possibility hurt far more than losing money. For 10 years, he had believed every sacrifice protected people he loved. If those sacrifices had instead become stepping stones toward private investments, the betrayal reached beyond finances. It reached into trust. Ethan opened another folder. "I found something else." Inside was a list of recorded mortgages. "The lake house?" Ethan nodded. "The property has appreciated significantly." Juan studied the figures. "It was refinanced twice." "Yes." "Nothing improper about that?" "No." Ethan pointed to the most recent filing. "But notice the date." It had occurred only a few weeks before Richard asked Juan for another $45,000 in temporary bridge financing. Juan frowned. "If the refinance provided additional liquidity, he may not have needed your assistance, unless the money served another purpose." "Correct." Neither man speculated further. Facts first, conclusions later. Before leaving, Juan thanked Ethan. "I appreciate your caution." Ethan smiled. "I've learned something over the years." "What's that?" "The truth survives careful examination." "It rarely survives emotional arguments." Driving home, Juan repeated those words to himself. The truth survives careful examination. That weekend, Sophie suggested spending Sunday together without visiting either family. "I miss having a day that's just ours." Juan smiled. "So do I." They drove south toward Brown County State Park. Autumn colors covered the hills in shades of red, gold, and orange. They hiked quiet trails, shared sandwiches on a wooden overlook, and talked about everything except money. For the first time in weeks, Juan felt almost peaceful. At one point, Sophie slipped her hand into his. "I've been thinking." "About what?" "We've spent so many years taking care of everyone else." Juan looked at her. "What are you saying?" "I think it's time we started making plans for ourselves." The sentence caught him completely off guard. "What kind of plans?" "A trip. A different house someday. Maybe starting our own foundation for children with disabilities." She smiled shyly. "I've always wanted that." Juan listened carefully. Nothing she said sounded selfish. Nothing suggested someone planning to take advantage of him. Instead, she sounded like a woman finally hoping to build a future together. That conversation strengthened his growing belief. Whatever Richard and Kyle were doing, Sophie might genuinely be outside it. On Monday morning, Juan arrived at work before sunrise. As he unlocked his office, his assistant stepped into the hallway. "Mr. Ross?" "Good morning." "You received a visitor about 20 minutes ago." "Who?" "He didn't leave a business card." She hesitated. "He said his name was Richard Bennett." Juan stopped walking. "My father-in-law came here." "Yes." "He said it wasn't urgent." "What did he want?" "He asked whether you were available." I told him you hadn't arrived yet." Juan thanked her and entered his office. Richard had never visited his workplace before. Not once in 10 years. The timing felt unusual. Less than an hour later, his phone rang. Richard's name appeared on the screen. "Morning, Juan." "Morning. I stopped by your office earlier. My assistant mentioned it. I was in the area." Juan waited. "I actually wanted to ask you something in person." "What is it?" Richard's tone remained cheerful. "I've been considering another investment opportunity." Juan closed his eyes briefly. "Richard, I know. I said the last one would be the last." He laughed as though it were harmless. "But this really is different," Juan spoke calmly. "I've decided not to make any additional financial commitments right now." Silence filled the line, only for 2 seconds. Then Richard recovered. "Of course. I understand. We'll figure something out." The conversation ended politely. Too politely. That evening, Richard called Sophie instead. Juan overheard only part of the discussion. Her voice sounded apologetic. "I'm sorry, Dad. We're trying to be more careful with long-term planning." She paused. "No. I didn't say Juan refused because he doesn't trust you." Another pause. "I said we're discussing our future." When she ended the call, she looked disappointed. "Dad's upset." Juan nodded. "I guessed. He says opportunities don't wait." Juan answered gently. "Neither should our own future." She looked at him for several moments. Then she smiled. "I think you're right." Across town, Richard ended a different phone call. Kyle sat across from him inside the lake house study. "Well?" Kyle asked. Richard placed his phone on the desk. Juan said no. Kyle frowned. "That's new." "Yes." Susan looked up from the paperwork spread across the table. "Do you think he suspects something?" Richard didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stared through the window toward the lake. Finally, he spoke. "I don't know." Kyle folded his arms. "What if he starts asking questions?" Richard's expression hardened. "Then we move faster." "What does that mean?" Richard closed the folder containing the estate planning documents. "It means we finish everything before he understands what he's looking at." Miles away, Juan had no idea that another conversation had just taken place. But for the first time in 10 years, he had done something he had never done before. He had refused Richard Bennett's request for money. And somewhere beneath Richard's calm voice, that single word "no" had begun changing the entire balance of power. The change was subtle. No one argued. No voices were raised. No dramatic accusations filled the room. Yet after Juan Ross refused Richard Bennett's latest request for money, something inside the family shifted. Juan noticed it almost immediately. Phone calls became less frequent. Richard no longer checked in simply to ask how work was going. Kyle stopped sending casual text messages about sports or local events. Even Susan's weekly invitations for Sunday dinner suddenly became less enthusiastic. For years, Juan had believed those conversations reflected genuine closeness. Now he wondered how many had simply been opportunities waiting for the next financial request. He disliked himself for thinking that way. Cynicism had never suited him. The following Thursday, Ethan Brooks called again. "I've organized another report." Juan met him after work. This time the conference table held a large wall chart connecting dates, transfers, business filings, and property transactions. It resembled the type of timeline detectives assembled in crime documentaries. Except Ethan pointed to it immediately. "Remember, none of this proves misconduct." "I understand. It simply helps us understand the sequence." Juan appreciated the reminder. Facts first, stories later. Ethan traced the timeline with a pencil. The Bennett family experienced legitimate financial hardship during the early years. Juan nodded. "I know. I've reviewed tax liens, foreclosure notices, court filings, and recorded judgments." "They were real." "They absolutely were." Juan felt relieved. At least the beginning of the story had been genuine. They truly needed help. So I wasn't imagining that. No, Ethan continued, but approximately 6 years ago their financial position improved dramatically. What changed? A combination of debt relief, recovering real estate values, and several successful investments. Juan leaned forward. So, why did the emergency requests continue? Ethan folded his hands. I can't answer motive. I can only answer what the documents show. He slid another page across the table. According to publicly available mortgage releases and business filings, Richard's estimated net worth appeared to have increased steadily over recent years, not spectacularly, but consistently. Certainly enough that repeated financial emergencies seemed increasingly difficult to explain. Juan studied the figures. If these estimates are reasonably accurate, they're no longer living paycheck to paycheck. Correct. And yet they kept accepting money, Ethan answered carefully. They continued requesting financial assistance. The distinction mattered. They continued requesting financial assistance. The distinction mattered. Accepting and requesting were not exactly the same. Juan thanked Ethan before leaving. Driving home, he found himself remembering dozens of conversations from previous years. Richard standing beside a hospital bed, insisting there was no other option. Susan crying over unpaid medical expenses. Kyle promising every loan would be repaid once business stabilized. At the time, every story had sounded believable. Perhaps many of them had been. Perhaps later stories simply borrowed credibility from earlier truths. Friday evening, Sophie found Juan sitting alone on the back patio. She wrapped a blanket around both of them. You've been quiet lately. I know. Work? Partly. She studied him. I miss talking. Juan turned toward her. So do I. After several moments of silence, Sophie asked a question that surprised him. Can I ask you something honestly? Always? Have my parents asked you for money again? Juan looked into her eyes. There was concern there, not calculation. Why do you ask? Because Dad called twice this week. And he sounded frustrated. She hesitated. He kept saying you were becoming different. Juan smiled faintly. Different how? He didn't really explain. Juan reached for her hand. I've simply decided we should spend more time planning our own future. She squeezed his fingers. I'd like that. He considered telling her everything. The property documents, the conversation at the lake house, the financial timeline. Instead, he waited. He still lacked enough evidence to explain the entire picture fairly. The last thing he wanted was to force Sophie into choosing between her husband and her parents before understanding the truth herself. Saturday afternoon, Juan visited his longtime financial advisor, Martin Alvarez. Martin had retired from full-time practice but still consulted with several long-time clients. After listening carefully, Martin smiled sadly. I remember warning you years ago. Juan nodded. You did. I told you generosity requires boundaries. I thought boundaries meant mistrust. Martin shook his head. No. Boundaries preserve trust. Juan remained silent. Martin continued. When people never hear the word no, they slowly stop recognizing the value of yes. The sentence stayed with Juan. Before leaving, Martin asked one final question. If everything you're beginning to suspect proves true, Juan looked up. What do you actually want? The question caught him off guard. I don't know. You've had several weeks to think. I have. So, Juan answered honestly. I don't want revenge. Martin nodded approvingly. I believe you. I don't even want their money back. What do you want? Juan stared through the office window toward the Indianapolis skyline. I want the truth. And after that, I want my wife to know the truth. Martin smiled. Then don't lose sight of that goal. Sunday brought another family gathering. Richard appeared unusually friendly, almost too friendly. Throughout lunch, he complimented Juan repeatedly. No one works harder than Juan. We've always appreciated everything you've done. You've been like a son to us. Each compliment sounded polished, practiced. Juan thanked him politely. After dessert, Richard invited him into the study. I wanted to show you something. He opened a cabinet and removed several framed photographs, family vacations, holiday celebrations, wedding pictures. You've been part of all this. Juan smiled. I'm grateful. Richard placed one photograph back on the shelf. You know, he paused. Families shouldn't keep score. Juan felt the sentence settle between them. I agree. Richard looked relieved. We help each other because we're family. We do. So, whatever happened in the past, he gestured vaguely. Money comes and goes. Juan answered calmly. It does. Richard searched his face, almost as though trying to determine whether Juan knew more than he admitted. Finally, Richard laughed. I always knew you understood what mattered. Juan smiled. I believe I do. Neither man mentioned specific numbers. Neither mentioned property. Neither mentioned estate planning. The conversation became a contest of hidden meanings. When Juan returned to the living room, Sophie noticed something. You two were gone a while. Just talking. Everything okay? Juan nodded. Everything's fine. Across the room, Richard watched them together. His smile never faded, but Kyle quietly stepped beside him. What do you think? Richard kept his voice low. I can't read him anymore. Is that a problem? Richard looked toward Juan. For 10 years, he paused. I always knew exactly what he was thinking. Now, for the first time, he wasn't sure. That uncertainty unsettled him far more than Juan's refusal to write another check. Later that night, as Juan prepared for bed, his phone vibrated. The message came from Melissa Grant. Only 6 words appeared on the screen. We need to meet tomorrow morning. No explanation followed. No additional details. Only those 6 words. Juan stared at the message for several seconds. Somewhere another piece of the puzzle had just fallen into place. He simply didn't know yet whether it would protect his family or change it forever. Juan arrived at Melissa Grant's office 15 minutes before their scheduled meeting. She rarely requested meetings without providing at least a brief explanation. This time, however, she had revealed nothing. When her assistant showed him into the conference room, Melissa was already reviewing several folders spread neatly across the table. She looked up and smiled. Good. You're early. You sounded concerned. I was careful. There is a difference. Juan sat across from her. What happened? Melissa slid one folder toward him. Ethan shared his preliminary financial analysis with your permission. Juan nodded. I asked him to. I've reviewed it. She folded her hands. Legally speaking, the financial questions are significant. Juan remained silent. But that's not why I asked you here. She reached into another folder and removed a single document. I requested copies of publicly recorded filings related to the property transfer. Juan immediately recognized the parcel number. The lake house. Melissa nodded. Everything I'm about to tell you comes from public records. She placed the document between them. The transfer isn't complete. Juan looked surprised. It isn't. No. I thought it already happened. It has been initiated. Not finalized. Juan carefully read the first page. Several signatures remained outstanding. One notarization had not yet occurred. The recording process appeared incomplete. "What does that mean?" Melissa answered cautiously. "It means whatever Richard is trying to accomplish has not yet been finished." Juan exhaled slowly. For the first time in weeks, he felt a measure of relief. Nothing irreversible had happened, at least not yet. Melissa continued. "I also noticed something unusual." "What?" "The draft paperwork references a family trust." Juan frowned. "I've never heard Richard mention a trust." "Neither had I." She tapped another page. "The trust itself isn't unusual. Many families create them. So, what's unusual?" "The timing." She compared dates. "The trust appears to have been created shortly after Richard began discussing estate planning." Juan studied the documents. "Does Sophie's signature appear?" "Not on the trust formation documents. Only on later acknowledgments." Juan looked thoughtful. "So she may not even know the entire structure." "That's possible." Melissa refused to speculate beyond that. Instead, she closed the folder. "I want to be absolutely clear. Nothing here proves fraud." Juan appreciated the reminder. "It does show something else." "What?" "Complex legal planning involving valuable property." Juan nodded. "And if family members misunderstand those documents, misunderstandings can become very expensive." Juan understood exactly what she meant. Misunderstanding did not necessarily require dishonesty. Sometimes people signed documents they barely read. Sometimes they trusted explanations that were incomplete. Neither automatically meant criminal intent. Melissa leaned forward. "I want you to promise me something." "What?" "No confrontations." Juan smiled faintly. "You're the second professional who's told me that. And hopefully the second one you'll listen to." "I will." She looked relieved. "Good. Because I believe the truth is still developing." After leaving Melissa's office, Juan drove directly to work. He buried himself in meetings, budgets, and operational planning until nearly 6 o'clock. As he prepared to leave, his assistant entered carrying a small package. "This was delivered for you. No return address." She shook her head. "It was hand-delivered." Juan opened the plain brown envelope carefully. Inside lay a flash drive. Nothing else. No letter, no name, no explanation. He examined it for several moments before placing it inside his desk drawer. He would not connect an unknown device to his work computer. Company cybersecurity policies prohibited it. That evening, he showed the flash drive to Melissa over a secure video call. Her response came immediately. "Don't plug it into any personal computer." "I wasn't planning to. I'll arrange to have it examined safely." The next morning, Juan dropped the device at her office. 3 days passed before she called again. "We've finished reviewing it." "What was on it?" "A collection of scanned documents." Juan waited. "Mostly financial records." His heartbeat quickened. "Related to Richard's, yes." "What kind of records?" "Records, invoices, loan summaries, construction estimates, bank correspondence." Juan leaned forward in his chair. "Anything illegal?" Melissa shook her head. "Nothing that clearly indicates criminal conduct." She paused. "But there is something important." "What?" "Several construction invoices for the lake house were marked as paid." Juan frowned. "Paid? Months ago." He immediately remembered Richard requesting $45,000 in emergency bridge financing. "If these invoices were already paid," Melissa finished the thought, then they could not have been the reason for requesting additional money." Neither spoke for several seconds. Juan finally asked the obvious question. "Who sent the flash drive?" "I don't know. No metadata. Nothing useful. It may have been copied deliberately before delivery. Juan nodded slowly. Someone wanted him to see those documents. But why anonymously? Later that weekend, Juan and Sophie attended a neighborhood charity fundraiser. They spent the afternoon helping organize donations for a local youth center. Watching Sophie laugh with children reminded Juan why he had fallen in love with her. She gave without expecting recognition. She listened without judging. She stayed long after others left because one little girl wanted help finishing a puzzle. Driving home, Juan glanced toward her. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "If you inherited property someday," she smiled, "I'd probably panic." He laughed. "Seriously?" "I am serious," she shrugged. "I've never cared much about property. What matters to me is having a home." She looked out the window. "If my parents leave something one day, that's their decision." "I've honestly never thought about it." Juan believed her. Her answer came too naturally to sound rehearsed. That evening, while Sophie showered upstairs, the doorbell rang. Juan opened the front door to find an older man standing quietly on the porch. Gray hair, weathered jacket, kind eyes. "Mr. Ross." "Yes." "My name is Harold Dixon." Juan waited. "I worked with Richard Bennett nearly 20 years ago." The name meant nothing to Juan. "I apologize for arriving unannounced. What can I do for you?" Harold hesitated. "I've been trying to decide whether to come here for months." Juan studied him carefully. The man appeared nervous, not hostile. Finally, Harold reached into his coat pocket and removed a worn business card. On the back, he had written a single sentence: "Richard still solves problems the same way he always did." Juan looked up. "What does that mean?" Harold sighed deeply. "It means I think you're asking the wrong questions." Before Juan could respond, Harold added quietly, "You shouldn't only be asking where the money went. You should be asking why Richard has always needed someone else to carry the risk." Without another word, Harold turned, walked to an aging pickup truck parked across the street, and drove away. Juan remained standing on the porch long after the taillights disappeared around the corner. For weeks, he had been following bank records, property filings, and financial timelines. Now a complete stranger had introduced an entirely different possibility. Perhaps the money itself was only part of the story. Perhaps the real answer lay in understanding Richard Bennett's pattern of decisions over decades rather than dollars alone. And if that were true, Juan realized his investigation was only just beginning. Juan barely slept after Harold Dixon's unexpected visit. The older man's words repeated in his mind. "You shouldn't only be asking where the money went. You should be asking why Richard has always needed someone else to carry the risk." Those sentences felt different from everything Juan had heard so far. Until now, every question had centered on dollars, property, and documents. Harold had pointed toward behavior, patterns, character. The next morning, Juan arrived at work before sunrise, as usual. He unlocked his office, brewed a cup of black coffee, and opened a new page in his notebook. Across the top, he wrote one question: "Who benefits if the risk belongs to someone else?" He stared at the words for several moments. Richard had often described himself as a businessman willing to take chances. But the more Juan reviewed the past decade, the more he realized Richard's biggest risks had rarely been carried by Richard alone. When taxes became overwhelming, Juan provided the money. When lawsuits threatened the family business, Juan stepped in. When mortgages became impossible to manage, Juan refinanced obligations. When investments required temporary capital, Juan supplied it. If the investments succeeded, Richard celebrated. If they failed, Juan absorbed part of the damage. For the first time, Juan recognized a pattern that extended far beyond individual requests. Late that morning, Melissa Grant called. "I've been thinking about Harold Dixon. You've heard of him?" "I have." Juan sat upright. "You know him?" "Not personally." But Richard mentioned him years ago." "What did he say?" Melissa searched her memory. They worked together on several commercial projects before you married Sophie. And they eventually stopped doing business together. Did Richard ever explain why? No. He simply said their philosophies were different. Juan thanked her. It wasn't much. Still, it gave Harold's visit additional credibility. That evening, Juan decided not to investigate further. Instead, he invited Sophie to dinner at the small Italian restaurant where they had celebrated their first wedding anniversary. She smiled the moment she realized where they were going. I haven't been here in years. I know. I wanted to change that. Throughout dinner, they talked about memories rather than problems. Their first apartment, their honeymoon, the old sedan that broke down twice during their first year of marriage. They laughed more that evening than they had in weeks. As dessert arrived, Sophie grew quiet. Can I tell you something? Always. She looked down at her coffee. I've been feeling guilty. Juan waited patiently. I think my parents have depended on us for too long. He remained silent. I used to tell myself it was temporary. She sighed. Now I'm not so sure. Juan reached across the table. What made you say that? My mom called again yesterday. And she asked whether we could help with another expense. Juan didn't interrupt. I told her we needed to think about our own future. She looked embarrassed. She sounded disappointed. Juan squeezed her hand. You didn't do anything wrong. I know. It just felt strange. For years, Sophie had measured love by how much she could give. Now she was discovering that healthy relationships also required limits. Driving home, Juan felt more convinced than ever that she had not participated in whatever Richard had been planning. 2 days later, Ethan Brooks requested another meeting. When Juan arrived, several additional documents lay on the conference table. I found something interesting. What is it? It's not about money. Juan smiled. That seems to be happening a lot lately. Ethan nodded. I started reviewing corporate filings more carefully. He handed Juan a printed chart listing every limited liability company connected to Richard over the previous 15 years. Some companies lasted only months. Others survived several years before quietly dissolving. What stands out? Juan asked. Ethan pointed to one column. Managers changed frequently. Juan looked closer. Richard appeared repeatedly. So did Kyle. Several outside investors appeared once and disappeared. But notice something else. Juan continued reading. Almost every company had borrowed money from different sources. Banks, private lenders, individual investors, family members. What are you seeing? Juan asked. Ethan answered thoughtfully. I'm seeing someone who consistently preferred using other people's capital whenever possible. Even when he had assets. Especially then. Juan frowned. Why? There are perfectly legitimate business reasons to leverage outside funding. He paused. But there are also personalities that become comfortable allowing others to shoulder uncertainty. Juan remembered Harold's words. Carry the risk. The phrase returned with new meaning. None of this proved Richard had broken the law. It suggested something different, a lifelong habit. When facing uncertainty, Richard instinctively looked for someone else willing to stand between him and potential loss. For years, that person had been Juan. Saturday afternoon, Richard unexpectedly appeared at Juan and Sophie's house carrying homemade cookies from Susan. He seemed relaxed, friendly, almost nostalgic. I was in the neighborhood. Juan invited him inside. They sat in the living room while Sophie prepared tea. Richard looked around the house. You've always kept things simple. Juan smiled. We like it that way. You could afford much more. Maybe. Richard chuckled. I sometimes forget how disciplined you are. After Sophie returned with tea, the conversation drifted toward family memories. Eventually, Richard looked directly at Juan. I've been thinking. About what? I don't want money to ever come between family. Juan met his eyes. Neither do I. Richard nodded slowly. I'm glad. There was another brief silence. Then Richard asked almost casually, You've always trusted me, haven't you? The question surprised Juan. I've tried to. Tried. Juan chose his words carefully. Trust grows through honesty. Richard studied him. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Then Sophie returned from the kitchen carrying fresh cookies. The moment disappeared. Richard laughed and changed the subject. An hour later, after he had gone home, Sophie turned toward Juan. That was a strange question. Juan looked up. Which one? You've always trusted me, she frowned. I've never heard Dad ask anything like that. Neither had Juan. That night, another unexpected phone call arrived. It was Harold Dixon. I won't keep you long. Juan stepped onto the back porch. I'm listening? I remembered something after our conversation. What? There was another man. Juan waited. Years ago, Richard convinced him to finance part of a development project. What happened? The project eventually succeeded. Juan frowned. Then why does it matter? Harold sighed. Because when the project nearly failed, Richard had already protected himself. How? I don't know every detail. But I remember who would have lost everything if it had collapsed. The investor. Yes. Harold paused before adding one final sentence. I've always wondered whether Richard believed sharing success meant sharing profits. Or simply sharing the danger until success finally arrived. The call ended. Juan stood alone beneath the porch light. He no longer believed this story was about one lake house, or one property transfer, or even $1 million. He was beginning to see a much older pattern, one that may have shaped Richard Bennett's decisions for decades. And somewhere inside that pattern, Juan suspected lay the answer to the question that mattered most. Not whether Richard had accepted his generosity, but whether Richard had quietly built his entire future on it. Monday morning began with an unexpected sense of calm. For the first time since overhearing Richard at the lake house, Juan Ross no longer felt driven by emotion. He felt focused. Every new conversation, every document, every memory now fit into an organized timeline. There were still unanswered questions, many of them. But the confusion that had haunted him for weeks had slowly been replaced by purpose. He would discover the truth. Not to punish anyone, not to humiliate anyone, simply to understand what had really happened during the last 10 years. At 8 o'clock, Juan received a call from Melissa Grant. I have good news. He smiled for the first time that morning. I could use some. I've completed a preliminary legal review. And, based on everything we've collected so far, I still don't see evidence that Sophie intentionally misled you. Juan closed his eyes for a brief moment. He hadn't realized how heavily that uncertainty had weighed on him. Thank you. I know that's important to you. It is, Melissa continued. That doesn't answer every question. I know. But I wanted you to hear that first. They scheduled another meeting for Wednesday afternoon. After hanging up, Juan found himself thinking about the day he had proposed to Sophie. She had cried before saying yes. Not because she doubted him, because she believed she wasn't bringing anything into the marriage except family problems. Juan remembered telling her something he still believed. We're building a life together. Not buying one, not inheriting one, building one. That promise mattered now more than ever. Later that afternoon, Ethan Brooks sent Juan another spreadsheet. This one compared the timing of Richard's investment activity with Juan's financial assistance. Again, Ethan avoided conclusions. Instead, he highlighted observable patterns. Periods when Richard requested significant financial help were often followed within months by new business ventures. Sometimes the timing was close. Sometimes nearly a year separated the events. Nothing proved direct connections. But one fact became increasingly difficult to ignore. Richard's appetite for investment seemed to grow whenever his personal financial pressure decreased. Juan leaned back in his office chair. Perhaps that was simply how entrepreneurs behaved. Perhaps. Still, he couldn't forget Harold Dixon's warning. Richard always preferred someone else to absorb uncertainty. Tuesday evening brought another family dinner. This time, however, Sophie suggested inviting her parents to Juan and Sophie's home rather than visiting theirs. "I think it would be nice." Juan agreed. Susan arrived carrying flowers. Richard brought dessert. Kyle showed up 30 minutes late, apologizing because of a construction meeting. The evening began pleasantly. Conversation centered on football neighborhood events and holiday plans. Halfway through dinner, Richard admired the dining room. "You've kept this house beautifully." Sophie smiled. "We're happy here." Richard nodded. "But eventually you'll want something larger." "We've talked about it," Sophie admitted. Juan looked toward her with mild surprise. They had discussed moving someday, though never urgently. Richard leaned forward. "Actually," he smiled, "I've been thinking about helping." Juan listened quietly. "What do you mean?" Sophie asked. Richard glanced between them. "If everything goes according to plan." He paused dramatically. "Our estate planning will eventually make upgrading much easier." Sophie laughed. "Dad, that's years away." "Maybe. But planning matters." Juan noticed something subtle. Every time Richard mentioned future assets, he spoke confidently. Every time immediate finances arose, he emphasized uncertainty. The contrast fascinated him. After dinner, Susan helped Sophie clean the kitchen, while Richard wandered into the backyard with Juan. The autumn air felt cool. Richard folded his hands behind his back. "You've seemed distant lately." Juan answered honestly. "I've been thinking. About us. About the future." Richard nodded slowly. "That's good." He hesitated. "I've always considered you family." "I know. I hope you believe that." Juan looked directly at him. "I've always tried to." Richard smiled. "Good." Then, almost casually, he asked another unexpected question. "You've never regretted helping us, have you?" Juan considered the question carefully. "I've never regretted helping people I believed needed help." Richard's smile remained, but something in his eyes changed, only briefly. Then it disappeared. "I appreciate hearing that." Inside the house, Sophie watched through the kitchen window. "They've been talking a long time." Susan dried another plate. "Your father worries." "About what?" "That Juan carries too much responsibility." Sophie smiled softly. "He does." Susan placed the towel down. "You've always had a good husband." "I know. I've never forgotten that." The sincerity in Sophie's voice surprised Susan. For a moment, guilt crossed her face. It vanished almost as quickly as it appeared. When everyone finally left, Sophie curled beside Juan on the living room sofa. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "If my parents ever disappointed you," she searched for the right words. "Would you tell me?" Juan answered without hesitation. "Yes." "You wouldn't hide it?" "No." She nodded slowly. "I hope so." "Why?" "Because I don't ever want us keeping secrets." Juan wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "Neither do I." Upstairs later that night, Juan opened the notebook that had become his private journal. He reviewed every fact collected so far. Verified financial transfers, property records, business filings, the anonymous flash drive, Harold Dixon's statements, Richard's repeated requests for money. One page remained blank. At the top, Juan wrote another heading: Questions Sophie deserves answers to. He began making a list. Did she fully understand the property documents? Why had Richard collected the certified envelope from her? What exactly was the purpose of the family trust? Why had Richard said Juan would have no claim to anything he had paid for? Juan stared at the final question. It bothered him more than any other. Not because of the money, because it revealed intent. Those words had not been spoken by someone expressing gratitude. They had been spoken by someone planning ahead. The following morning, Melissa called earlier than expected. Juan? You sound serious. I've received one additional document. From where? A public filing that was updated overnight. Juan stood from his desk. What changed? Melissa took a slow breath. The lake house transfer hasn't been completed. I know. But someone has filed an amendment. Juan's pulse quickened. What kind of amendment? I don't want to discuss it over the phone. Is it important? Yes. She paused. It doesn't answer everything, but I believe it finally tells us who has been making the decisions. Juan looked out across the warehouse parking lot below his office. For weeks, every clue had raised more questions than answers. Now, for the first time, Melissa believed one document could identify the person directing the entire plan. Juan grabbed his jacket. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Juan arrived at Melissa Grant's office exactly 23 minutes after ending the phone call. She was waiting in the conference room with a single folder resting on the table. Unlike previous meetings, there were no stacks of documents, no elaborate timelines, only one file. Melissa waited until Juan sat down before sliding it across the table. The amendment was recorded this morning. Juan opened the folder carefully. Several pages had been stamped by the county recorder's office. He immediately recognized the parcel number for the lake house. What changed? Melissa pointed to one paragraph. The trust language was revised. Juan read silently. Certain administrative provisions had been updated. Additional successor instructions had been added. Nothing appeared unusual to someone unfamiliar with estate documents. I don't understand. You wouldn't. Melissa smiled gently. Most people wouldn't. She pointed farther down the page. This section identifies who has authority to recommend amendments before the trust becomes fully operational. Juan followed her finger. Only one name appeared: Richard Bennett. No committee? Juan asked. No. No joint approval? No. So every decision has been his? Melissa nodded. Based on these documents, yes. Juan leaned back. So Sophie wasn't directing any of this. I've seen no evidence that she was. And Susan? Melissa shook her head. Her role appears limited. Juan closed the folder. For weeks he had feared that multiple family members had secretly worked together. Instead, the document suggested something different. Richard had remained at the center of nearly every important decision. Melissa spoke carefully. Remember, directing estate planning isn't improper. I know. The issue isn't that Richard made decisions. The issue is whether everyone understood those decisions. Juan nodded. Especially Sophie. Exactly. Melissa handed him another page. This is what concerns me. It listed several future administrative steps that still required signatures. One signature line remained blank. Sophie's. So nothing is complete. Correct. Juan felt another wave of relief. The situation remained unresolved. There was still time for honest conversations before anything became permanent. As Juan prepared to leave, Melissa asked one unexpected question. If Sophie truly knows very little, he looked up. How would you want her to learn the truth? He thought for several moments. Not from an argument. Good. Not from accusations. Melissa smiled. And not in front of her family. Definitely not. She nodded approvingly. I hoped you'd say that. Back at work, Juan struggled to concentrate. His thoughts kept returning to Sophie's face during recent conversations. She had never once defended complicated legal paperwork. She had never pressured him to continue financing her parents. If anything, she had begun encouraging him to think about their own future. That mattered. Late that afternoon, Juan received another phone call. This time it came from Martin Alvarez. I heard you've been busy. Juan laughed quietly. News travels. Melissa had apparently spoken with him. I wanted to remind you of something. I'm listening. People sometimes confuse kindness with unlimited capacity. Juan smiled. You've said something similar before. I have, Martin continued, but there's another lesson. The healthiest people eventually discover that saying no doesn't destroy relationships. It reveals them. Juan thanked him before ending the call. The sentence lingered long afterward. Perhaps Richard's reaction to hearing no had revealed more than 10 years of hearing yes. That evening, Juan arrived home to find Sophie sitting at the kitchen table surrounded by papers. She looked frustrated. I finally started reading those estate documents. Juan removed his jacket. How's it going? She sighed dramatically. I feel like I'm reading another language. He smiled. Need help? I was hoping you'd say that. He sat beside her. The folder contained copies rather than original documents. Most pages described general estate planning concepts. Several sections referred to future distributions. Others explained trustee responsibilities. Juan noticed something important. Many pages referenced attachments that were not included. Are pages missing? Sophie looked down. I wondered the same thing. She searched through the folder again. I thought maybe Dad forgot to include everything. Juan remained calm. Did he explain why you're receiving these? He said he wanted me to become familiar with them. And that's all? Pretty much? She rubbed her temples. I honestly haven't paid much attention. Juan looked at her carefully. Sophie. She met his eyes. If there's anything you don't understand, I'll ask. No. He smiled warmly. We'll ask. Her expression softened. I like that better. For the next hour, they read through every page together. Juan intentionally avoided mentioning the amendment Melissa had shown him. Instead, he simply asked questions whenever language seemed unclear. Sometimes Sophie knew the answer. Most of the time, she didn't. By the end of the evening, one conclusion became obvious. She possessed only a partial set of documents. Large portions of the overall plan remained absent. When they finished, Sophie closed the folder. I hate complicated paperwork. Juan laughed. I've noticed. She leaned against him. Can I confess something? Always. I've trusted my parents with legal things my whole life. I know. I probably shouldn't have. Juan chose his response carefully. Trust isn't wrong. Blind trust can become risky. She nodded slowly. I think I'm beginning to understand that. The following morning, Richard called. Morning, Juan. Morning. I wanted to invite you both to dinner Friday. Juan hesitated. We'll see if Sophie is available. Richard sounded cheerful. Wonderful. Then he added, almost casually, oh, and remind her to bring those estate papers. Juan's expression remained unchanged. I'll let her know. After ending the call, Juan stared at his phone. Richard wanted the documents returned. Why now? Only days earlier he had insisted there was no urgency. Something had changed. Later that afternoon, Ethan Brooks stopped by Juan's office unexpectedly. "I was nearby." Juan closed the door behind him. "Everything okay?" Ethan placed another folder on the desk. "I've been reviewing one final issue." "What issue?" "The repayment acknowledgments from the early years." Juan nodded. "What about them?" Ethan smiled thoughtfully. "They tell us something your bank records never could." "What?" "They reveal Richard's original intentions." Juan looked confused. Ethan opened one of the signed acknowledgments. Each document referred to Juan's financial assistance as a loan or advance to be repaid when circumstances allowed. Every early document used similar language. Then Ethan placed a blank sheet beside them. The later transfers contained nothing comparable. Juan understood immediately. The language had changed over time. Not because of a written agreement, because the documentation had quietly disappeared. Ethan looked directly at him. Whether intentionally or gradually, everyone stopped treating your assistance as something that created an obligation. Juan nodded slowly. And eventually, people often begin believing the new version of the story. Juan sat silently after Ethan left. Perhaps that was the greatest danger of all. Not one dramatic lie, but hundreds of small assumptions repeated over years until they became accepted as truth. Outside his office window, employees ended another ordinary workday. Inside, Juan realized he was approaching the moment when assumptions would finally collide with documented facts. And when that happened, every relationship in the Bennett family would be tested. Friday arrived with an unusual sense of anticipation. Richard Bennett's invitation to dinner had remained unchanged. 6 o'clock. The family home. Bring the estate papers. Juan found himself thinking less about the invitation itself and more about Richard's sudden urgency. For weeks, nothing had appeared time-sensitive. Now Richard wanted the documents returned immediately. Something had changed. When Juan arrived home from work, Sophie was already getting ready. "The papers are in my bag," she said. Juan nodded. "Did your dad say why he needed them tonight?" "No. He just said he wanted to review a few things." She shrugged. "I'm guessing he found another typo or something." Juan forced a small smile. "I guess we'll find out." The drive to the Bennett home felt quieter than usual. Sophie looked out the passenger side window. "I've been thinking about what we talked about." "About trust." She nodded. "I don't want to sign anything anymore unless I understand it." Juan glanced toward her briefly. "I think that's a good decision." She smiled. "You know what's funny?" "What?" "I used to think asking questions meant you didn't trust people. And now I think asking questions shows you respect what you're signing." Juan couldn't have agreed more. When they arrived, Richard greeted them warmly. "Perfect timing." Susan hugged Sophie. Kyle appeared a few minutes later carrying a laptop instead of his usual backpack. Juan noticed it immediately. "Working tonight?" he asked casually. Kyle laughed. "Always." The answer sounded rehearsed. Dinner remained pleasant. Susan served homemade pot roast. Kyle talked about construction delays. Richard shared stories about an old fishing trip from years ago. To anyone watching, it looked like an ordinary family gathering. Only Juan noticed how often Richard glanced toward Sophie's handbag. Finally, after dessert, Richard stood. "Why don't we move into the study?" Sophie picked up her bag. "I brought the papers." "I knew you would." Inside the study, Richard closed the door. The room suddenly felt much smaller. He spread their documents across the desk. "I've realized I probably overwhelmed you." Sophie laughed. "That's one way to put it." I thought we'd simplify everything. Juan remained silent. Richard pointed to several pages. Most of this is routine. He flipped through them quickly. These are administrative. These concern future tax matters. These explain distributions. His explanations came rapidly, almost too rapidly. Sophie frowned. Can we slow down? Richard smiled. Of course. She pointed toward one paragraph. What exactly does this mean? Richard answered immediately. It simply keeps everything organized. And this, standard legal language. She pointed again. What about this section? Richard hesitated, only for a second, but Juan noticed. That's mostly procedural. Sophie looked unconvinced. I'm still confused. Juan spoke for the first time. Maybe Melissa could explain it. The room became perfectly still. Richard slowly looked toward Juan. Melissa. Our attorney. Richard forced a polite smile. I don't think that's necessary. Juan answered calmly. I found she's very good at explaining legal documents. Richard folded his hands. These papers concern our family's estate. Juan nodded. They do. I don't see why outside attorneys need to become involved. Sophie looked between both men. Wait. She frowned. Why wouldn't I want my own attorney explaining documents I'm supposed to understand? Richard opened his mouth, then closed it again. It was the first time Juan had ever seen him struggle to answer such a simple question. Finally, Richard laughed lightly. You certainly can. I just didn't want anyone charging unnecessary legal fees. Sophie smiled politely. I'd rather pay for understanding than save money by guessing. Juan looked down to hide his expression. He felt quietly proud of her. No accusation, no confrontation, just a reasonable request. The conversation shifted awkwardly after that. Within 20 minutes, the documents were back inside Sophie's bag. Nothing had been signed. Nothing had been changed. As Juan and Sophie prepared to leave, Richard walked them to the driveway. He waited until Sophie stepped ahead toward the car. Then he spoke quietly. You've changed. Juan met his eyes. Maybe. You used to trust us. I still want to. Richard studied him carefully. Then why involved attorneys? Juan answered honestly. Because important decisions deserve clear explanations. Richard didn't respond immediately. Instead, he nodded once. I suppose they do. The drive home remained mostly quiet. About halfway there, Sophie finally spoke. Dad seemed nervous. Juan kept his eyes on the road. What makes you say that? He usually loves explaining things. She looked thoughtful. Tonight, he kept trying to move past every question. Juan didn't answer. She continued, I've never noticed that before. When they arrived home, Sophie carried the estate papers directly into the living room. I'm calling Melissa Monday. Juan smiled. I think that's wise. I don't want Dad to feel offended. You can love someone and still ask questions. She nodded slowly. I think I'm finally learning that. Saturday morning brought another surprise. Harold Dixon called again. I heard Richard invited everyone over. Juan blinked. How did you know that? I still know people. Juan leaned against the kitchen counter. What did you want to tell me? Harold hesitated. I remembered something else. I'm listening. Years ago, Richard had a saying. What was it? Harold gave a tired laugh. He used to tell investors. There was a brief pause. The person who controls the paperwork controls the story. Juan repeated the sentence quietly. The person who controls the paperwork controls the story. That's right. Harold sighed. I never forgot it. After ending the call, Juan walked into his home office. He opened the notebook that had accompanied him throughout the investigation. He turned back to the very first page. At the beginning, he had written questions about money, then questions about property. Later came questions about trusts. Now he crossed out the original heading. In careful handwriting, he wrote a new one. Who has been controlling the story? He looked through every note collected over the past several weeks. Richard had explained the family's finances. Richard had managed conversations about emergencies. Richard had handled the county paperwork. Richard had collected documents. Richard had interpreted legal language. Richard had spoken privately about estate planning. Again and again, the same name appeared. Not because anyone had proven wrongdoing, but because nearly every important decision had flowed through one person. Sunday evening, Juan received a message from Melissa. It contained only one sentence. "I've finished reviewing every page Sophie brought home." A second message followed a moment later. "I think I finally know what Richard expected everyone to believe." Juan stared at the screen. For months he had been searching for hidden assets, then hidden documents, then hidden motives. Now Melissa believed she had identified something even more significant, not what Richard had hidden, but the story he had been carefully encouraging everyone else to accept. Juan arrived at Melissa Grant's office early Monday morning, carrying the folder Sophie had brought home from Richard's house. Melissa had already arranged every page across the conference table. Several sections were highlighted with small adhesive notes. She looked up as Juan entered. "I read everything twice." "And," Melissa motioned for him to sit, "I think I've finally understood what has been bothering me." Juan waited. "It isn't what the documents say. It's what they quietly encourage people to assume." Juan leaned forward. "What do you mean?" Melissa slid two nearly identical pages side by side. "Read these introductions." Juan read both paragraphs carefully. Neither contained anything obviously alarming. Each described the Bennett family's desire to preserve assets for future generations. Each referred to decades of sacrifice. Each praised Richard and Susan's commitment to building a lasting legacy. They sound normal. "They do." Melissa nodded. "Now tell me something." "What?" "Who do those introductions describe as creating that legacy?" Juan looked again. "They describe Richard and Susan." "Only Richard and Susan?" Melissa smiled gently. "Exactly." Juan frowned. So think about everything Ethan reconstructed." Juan immediately understood. More than 10 years of financial assistance, mortgage payments, medical expenses, tax obligations, business loans, emergency transfers. Without those contributions, many of the assets discussed inside the estate documents might never have survived. Yet none of that history appeared anywhere. Melissa wasn't suggesting Juan deserved recognition inside a legal document. She was pointing out something different. The narrative itself. Anyone reading the paperwork years later would naturally conclude that Richard and Susan alone had preserved the family's financial future. The decade of outside support simply disappeared. Juan sat quietly. "So the paperwork isn't rewriting ownership?" "No. It's rewriting memory." Melissa nodded. "That's exactly how I'd describe it." The sentence stayed with Juan. Rewriting memory. Not through lies, through omission. After a long silence, Melissa continued, "I don't believe these introductions have legal consequences. But they absolutely have emotional ones." Juan understood. Families often remembered stories long after they forgot numbers. If enough years passed, future generations might honestly believe Richard alone had rescued the family through wisdom and determination. The countless evenings Juan had quietly transferred money after work would become invisible. Not because anyone openly denied them, because nobody bothered to include them. Juan surprised himself by smiling. Melissa looked puzzled. What's funny? I spent weeks believing this investigation was about recovering money. And now, I don't think money was ever the thing I was afraid of losing. What was it? The truth. Melissa nodded. I think you're right. Later that afternoon, Juan met Ethan Brooks for coffee. Instead of discussing spreadsheets, Juan asked a different question. Have you ever seen families rewrite their own history? Ethan laughed softly. More times than I can count. Why? Because memory is uncomfortable. Juan listened. When families survive difficult periods, they usually simplify the story afterward. How? They remove embarrassing chapters. They forget who carried whom. They remember success. They quietly forget dependence. Juan stirred his coffee. So nobody has to be lying. Exactly, Ethan smiled. People often believe the version that's easiest to live with. Juan thought about Richard. Perhaps Richard had repeated his own version of events for so many years that he now believed it himself. That possibility somehow felt even sadder. Tuesday evening, Sophie came home carrying another envelope. It came from Dad. Juan looked up from the kitchen table. What is it? She opened it. Inside was a handwritten note. Just 3 sentences. Take your time reviewing everything. Ask whatever questions you need. I only want everyone to understand the plan. Sophie smiled. That seems reasonable? It does. She looked at Juan. I'm still meeting Melissa. I know. I hope Dad isn't offended. Juan answered honestly. If understanding the documents creates offense, he shrugged gently. Then the problem isn't the questions. She nodded. I suppose that's true. The appointment was scheduled for Thursday afternoon. Wednesday passed quietly. For the first time in weeks, Juan allowed himself to enjoy an ordinary evening. He and Sophie walked through their neighborhood after dinner. Children rode bicycles. Neighbors watered gardens. Someone grilled hamburgers a few houses away. Life continued. At one point, Sophie slipped her hand into his. I've missed this. So have I. You know something. What? I think all this paperwork distracted us from us. Juan smiled. It almost did. She rested her head briefly against his shoulder. I don't want that to happen again. Neither did he. The next afternoon, Sophie met Melissa alone. Juan deliberately stayed away. If Sophie was going to ask questions freely, she deserved the opportunity without feeling caught between her husband and her parents. The meeting lasted nearly 2 hours. When Sophie finally returned home, Juan could tell immediately that something had changed. Not panic, not anger, understanding. She placed the folder on the dining room table. I have a lot to learn. Juan poured 2 cups of tea. What did Melissa say? She explained everything. And Sophie took a deep breath. Most of the documents are perfectly ordinary. Juan nodded. That's good. But, she looked down, there are references to attachments I never received. Juan remained silent. And Melissa noticed the same thing. She opened the folder. There are summaries, but not every supporting document. Juan asked carefully, did she say that was improper? No. She simply said no one should sign or acknowledge paperwork they haven't seen in full. Juan smiled. That sounds like Melissa. Sophie looked directly at him. She also asked me something. What? Have you ever read The Complete Trust? Juan already knew the answer. I told her no. She sighed. I've never even asked to. The admission seemed to disappoint her more than anyone else. That evening, Sophie called Richard. Juan remained in the living room while she spoke privately in the kitchen. The conversation lasted almost 20 minutes. When she returned, she looked thoughtful rather than upset. How did it go? He sounded surprised. About what? I asked for every attachment. Juan waited. What did he say? He told me he'd have to gather everything. Did he sound bothered? She considered the question. Not exactly. He just kept saying the summaries should be enough. Juan looked at her. And are they? She smiled faintly. Not anymore. Friday morning, Juan received another call from Harold Dixon. I heard Sophie asked for the full documents. Juan almost laughed. You seem to hear everything. Harold chuckled. Small circles. Then his tone became serious. That's the smartest thing anyone has done so far. Why? Because partial paperwork often creates partial understanding. Juan leaned against his desk. Do you think Richard is hiding something? Harold answered more carefully than usual. I think Richard has always preferred being the person who explains the documents. Why does that matter? Because the person doing the explaining decides which details seem important. After the call ended, Juan sat quietly for several minutes. Months earlier, he would have assumed that whoever held the documents held the power. Now he realized something more subtle. The greater influence often belonged to the person interpreting those documents for everyone else. Late that afternoon, Melissa emailed Juan a brief note. No legal analysis, no attachments, just one observation. The complete trust should answer several remaining questions. If Richard provides every document Sophie requested, we may finally be looking at the entire picture instead of carefully selected pieces. Juan closed his laptop and looked out his office window. For the first time since this journey had begun, the next step no longer depended on hidden investigations or anonymous flash drives. It depended on a simple request from a daughter to her father. Show me everything. And Juan had a feeling the answer to that request would reveal far more than any spreadsheet ever could. The weekend passed without a response from Richard. For someone who normally returned calls within hours, his silence stood out. Sophie checked her phone several times, but tried not to make it obvious. He may just be busy, she said Sunday evening. Juan nodded. That's possible. Neither of them mentioned the trust documents again. There was nothing more to say until Richard answered. Monday morning, however, the answer finally arrived. Sophie received a text from her father. I found most of the documents. There are still a few older files in storage. Let's meet Wednesday evening. She showed the message to Juan. He said most, she observed. Juan noticed the same word immediately. Not all. She sighed. I'll ask about the rest. I think you should. Wednesday evening, they drove to Richard and Susan's house once again. This visit felt different. No large family dinner, no elaborate conversation, just Richard waiting in his study with 2 thick binders stacked neatly on the desk. There you are, he said with a warm smile. I've gathered everything I could find. Sophie sat beside him. Everything? Richard hesitated almost imperceptibly. Everything important. Juan heard the distinction. So did Sophie. She looked directly at her father. I actually meant everything. The room became quiet. Richard chuckled. You've certainly become thorough. I've learned that's a good habit. For a brief moment, Juan saw genuine surprise on Richard's face. Not anger, not irritation. Surprise. Richard slowly opened the first binder. This contains the complete trust agreement. He flipped through several sections. Susan quietly entered the room carrying coffee before sitting beside the window. She listened without interrupting. Sophie examined each divider carefully. Then she stopped. Dad. Yes. These section numbers jump. Richard leaned forward. They do. Yes. She pointed. It goes from section 7 to section 9. Richard adjusted his glasses. Looks like a copying mistake. Do you have section 8? I'll have to look. Sophie made a small note on a yellow legal pad. Juan watched silently. No accusations. Only questions. Exactly as Melissa had advised. They continued reviewing the binder. Several minutes later, Sophie asked another question. "Where are the schedules listing trust assets?" Richard answered quickly. "They'll be updated later." She looked confused. "But this says they already exist." Richard paused. "They're administrative. I'd still like to read them. I'll see if I can find them." Another note appeared on Sophie's legal pad. "Find asset schedules." The meeting continued for nearly 90 minutes. Every time Sophie requested clarification, Richard answered politely. Yet Juan noticed a pattern. General questions received immediate explanations. Specific document requests produced promises to locate additional paperwork later. As they prepared to leave, Sophie closed the binder. "Thank you for showing us this." Richard smiled. "I hope it helped." "It did." She paused. "But I'd still like the missing sections." Richard nodded. "I'll keep looking." Outside, as they walked toward the car, Susan quietly caught up with them. "Juan." He turned. "May I speak with you for a moment?" Sophie continued toward the car, giving them privacy. Susan folded her hands nervously. "I want to thank you." Juan looked surprised. "For what?" "For being patient." He waited. "I know this hasn't been easy." "No, it hasn't." She looked toward the house before lowering her voice. "Richard has always believed he could manage everything himself." Juan remained silent. "He doesn't always realize when other people need more information." It wasn't an apology, but it was the closest Susan had ever come. Juan answered gently. "I don't mind asking questions." She smiled sadly. "I know. Sometimes I wish we had all asked more of them years ago." Before Juan could respond, Susan returned to the house. Driving home, Sophie seemed unusually thoughtful. "My mom looked worried." "I noticed." "I don't think she's hiding anything." Juan considered that. "I think she's beginning to realize how much she doesn't know." Sophie nodded slowly. "I think so too." The following afternoon, Melissa reviewed photographs Sophie had taken of every page in the binders. She called Juan later that day. "I've identified several missing references." "How many?" "More than I expected." Juan frowned. "Missing by accident?" "I can't say." She continued scrolling through the digital images. "The trust repeatedly refers to exhibits. Asset schedules. Historical contribution records. Property allocation summaries. And none of them were included." Juan leaned back in his chair. "So the core agreement exists. But much of the supporting information does not." Melissa finished the sentence. "At least not in what Sophie received." Juan thanked her before hanging up. That evening, Ethan stopped by the house with updated financial charts. "I thought it would be easier to explain in person." They spread the papers across the dining room table. Ethan pointed to a long timeline beginning 12 years earlier. "I've been comparing your transfers with county valuation records." Juan studied the chart. "What did you find?" "Nothing dramatic." He smiled. "But something interesting." The value of the lake house had risen steadily over the years. Some increases reflected market conditions. Others followed significant renovations. Ethan pointed toward several dates. "These renovations occurred after periods when you provided substantial financial assistance to the family." Juan nodded. "I remember. So while I cannot say your money directly funded improvements," he tapped the timeline, "your support almost certainly freed other resources that could." Juan understood. Money is interchangeable. If Juan covered one urgent obligation, other available funds could be directed elsewhere. Again, there was no evidence of deception, only economics. Late Friday afternoon, Juan received another unexpected visitor at work, Harold Dixon. This time he carried an old accordion folder. "I've been cleaning my garage." Juan invited him into the conference room. Harold placed the folder on the table. "I almost threw this away." Inside were faded project notes from nearly 20 years earlier. Meeting agendas, financing outlines, handwritten calculations. One page caught Juan's attention immediately. Across the top, someone had written in blue ink, "Risk allocation discussion." Harold pointed toward the handwriting. "That's Richard's." Juan read several paragraphs. They discussed assigning financial responsibility among different investors if unexpected costs arose. Nothing improper, nothing illegal, simply ordinary planning documents. Yet one handwritten sentence stood out. Primary investors should absorb initial exposure whenever possible. Juan looked up. "What exactly does that mean?" Harold smiled faintly. "It means the people supplying the money take the first hit if things go badly. And Richard, he structured deals so he contributed expertise, relationships, or management." Juan thought quietly. "So he limited his personal downside. Whenever he could." Harold nodded. "Again," he raised a finger, "there's nothing unlawful about that. But after a while you begin noticing a philosophy." Juan finished the thought. "Someone else carries the greatest uncertainty." Harold smiled. "Exactly." After Harold left, Juan remained alone in the conference room. He looked from the old project notes to Ethan's financial timeline, then to Melissa's observations about missing exhibits. Each piece described something slightly different: legal planning, financial behavior, business strategy. Viewed separately, they meant little. Viewed together, they revealed a consistent pattern. Richard Bennett rarely rushed toward danger himself. He organized situations so that someone else stepped there first. For years, Juan had believed he was simply helping family through difficult seasons. Now he wondered whether, without realizing it, he had also become the person standing in front whenever financial uncertainty appeared. And that realization changed the way he viewed every sacrifice he had ever made. The greatest betrayal is not always the loss of money. It is the quiet loss of trust. Wealth can be earned again, houses can be rebuilt, and investments can recover. But when kindness is mistaken for obligation and generosity becomes an expectation instead of a gift, relationships begin to lose the honesty that once held them together. This story reminds us that true love is never measured by how much we sacrifice without limits. Healthy relationships require gratitude, respect, transparency, and the courage to have difficult conversations. Setting boundaries does not make you selfish. It protects your dignity and allows others to value what you freely choose to give. Sometimes the most powerful word you can say is no, because that single word reveals who respects you for who you are, not just for what you provide. Never stop being kind, but never stop being wise. Help others because it reflects your character, not because you fear losing their approval. Ask questions before signing documents, seek the truth before making judgments, and remember that trust grows strongest when it is built on honesty rather than assumptions. In the end, the most valuable inheritance we leave behind is not money or property. It is integrity, compassion, and the courage to do what is right, even when it is difficult. If this story touched your heart or reminded you of someone in your own life, please share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd truly love to hear your perspective. And if you enjoy meaningful stories about family trust resilience and life's most important lessons, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications.